So let's talk about urology, which we know is the branch of medicine that deals with the urinary system, and specifically the male reproductive tract. It's got a variety of functions, as you can see here. It adjusts blood volume and blood pressure, regulates the plasma concentrations of sodium, potassium, chloride, and other ions, stabilizes blood pH, excretes metabolic wastes and drugs or toxins, and it also regulates red blood cell production. And for this unit, we'll want to really have a good understanding of the basic gross anatomy. And so you can see that here. We have two kidneys. So the kidneys are bean-shaped. Here's an enlarged version. So the kidneys are metabolically very active. They perform the excretory functions of the urinary system and they produce urine. We have two ureters that receive the urine from the kidneys and conduct it to the urinary bladder. You can see the ureters here. The urinary bladder receives and stores the urine prior to the elimination of the urine from the body. And the transitional epithelial tissue of the urinary bladder are one of the things that allows it to stretch. Then the urethra is what drains the urine from the urinary bladder and transports it to the outside. And we can see that depicted here. So we know in males, it drains urine and semen. At the base of the bladder, there's what we call an internal and external urethra sphincter that regulates the urination. Now we'll look at the physical characteristics of urine. So here we can see each characteristic and the values that are within normal limits. Now, various pathologies are listed in the chart here. So we have the substances that we test for in the urine, and then the names of the various conditions that could exist, along with the possible causes of those conditions in the third column. Here in this chart, we have the urine volumes. Once again, we can see what's normal and then various pathologies if the volume is not within normal limits. And then in the column on the third column, rather, we can see the cause of each. All right, now for the gross anatomy of urine transport. So it's important to know that filtrate modification and urine production ends when the fluid enters our renal pelvis. The urinary tract, which we know consists of the ureters, the urinary bladder, and the urethra, is responsible for the transport, the storage, and the elimination of urine. For lab, it's going to be important that you're able to identify all of these structures along with the functions of each. So here is a close-up look at the ureter. The ureters are a pair of muscular tubes. They extend from the kidneys to the urinary bladder, and the distance of that is about a foot, about 12 inches. You can also see in this photo some of the transitional epithelium. The wall of each ureter actually consists of the transitional epithelium, various circular bands of smooth muscle, and we can see that layer here, and also an outer connective tissue layer that's continuous with the renal capsule and the peritoneum. Then we move into the urinary bladder, which we know is a hollow muscular organ, and it functions as a temporary reservoir, once again, for the storage of urine. The full urinary bladder can actually hold as much as 1 liter of urine. Now, this bladder is supported by 3 ligaments. The walls of the urinary bladder contain a mucosa, a submucosa, and a muscularis layer. The mucosa is, once again, transitional epithelium, and collectively, these 3 layers of smooth muscle are very, very strong. They compress the urinary bladder and expel its contents into the urethra. Now you can see here, we eventually get down to what we call the bottom of the bladder. And this is an internal urethral orifice. It contains a muscular internal urethral sphincter, which we see here. And that's composed of smooth muscle. And this sphincter provides an involuntary control over the discharge of the urine from the bladder. Okay, so here you get a much more detailed look. And the urethra extends from the neck of the urinary bladder to the urethral orifice. It transports urine to the exterior of the body. So in both sexes, where the urethra passes through the urogenital diaphragm, a circular band of skeletal muscle forms, and that's called the external urethral sphincter. Okay, and that's labeled here. Now that valve, or that muscular band, essentially acts as a valve to the voluntary control of urination. So that valve essentially allows us to start and stop our urine. We have now a pretty deep knowledge of the nervous system. So it's important to know that urination involves a reflex, which is coordinated by the nervous system. The urine reaches the urinary bladder by peristaltic contractions of the ureters, and the process of urination, called micturition, is coordinated by the micturition reflex. The stretch of the urinary bladder as a result of the urine accumulation stimulates our stretch receptors in the wall, and that's going to generate afferent fibers vis-a-vis action potentials in the pelvic nerves that carry the information to the spinal cord, generating a local reflex and a central reflex. The local reflex is parasympathetic in nature, and then the motor fibers and the pelvic nerves carry the motor commands back to the urinary bladder. Central reflex is where the inner neurons are relaying the sensation to the thalamus of the brain, where the projection fibers relay information from the thalamus to the cerebral cortex for conscious perception of the urge to urinate. And then, of course, if it's convenient at the time, the individual then voluntarily relaxes the external urethral sphincter. And naturally, relaxation of the external internal urethral sphincters leads to urination. So how much urine is typically produced by a healthy adult each day? Approximately 1,200 milliliters of urine. Okay, the other important topic here is to really have a good understanding of the gross anatomy of the kidney. Once again, a diagram like this could appear on a test or a practical. So you want to have a really good sense of the anatomy. The internal anatomy of the kidney. Specifically, we're looking at the renal cortex, the renal medulla, and the renal pelvis. Okay, a key word here is cortex. We know that that means the outermost portion of an organ. So in this case, renal, we're talking about the kidney, the outermost portion of the kidney. And this is actually in contact with the renal capsule. Then the renal medulla, we know that medulla means middle or toward the middle. And so we can find where that is on our diagram in here. And that extends from the renal cortex to the renal sinus. And then we have the renal pelvis, which is a flat funnel-shaped tube that drains urine from the cortex and the medulla toward the ureters. Another look at the internal anatomy there. Now let's look at the blood supply to the kidneys. So what supplies blood to the kidneys? Well, the renal arteries enter the kidney at the renal ileus to bring oxygenated, unfiltered blood into the kidney. And then the renal arteries branch into smaller and smaller and smaller vessels and so forth. We're not going to quite fully get into that in this course, but it's important to know that the renal arteries enter the kidney and they bring oxygenated, unfiltered blood into the kidneys themselves. Now let's look at the smaller microscopic anatomy of the kidney. Okay, we have nephrons, which are the functional units of the kidney. There are two types of nephrons. We have what's called cortical nephrons, which comprise about 85%, and juxtamedullary nephrons, which comprise about 15%. Okay, you can see that there's a lot of motor function here in terms of the blood flow. And we have the efferent arteriole is the connecting vessel between glomerulus and the tubular capillaries and vasa recta. Okay, a lot of microanatomy here. Some of this I'm just glancing over because we don't have to memorize it for this level course. Then we get into the physiology of urine production. So the physiology occurs in 3 steps. We have what we call non-selective filtration. And basically what that is unfiltered blood in the sensory arterioles enters the glomerulus. Pretty much anything small enough is forced into the Bowman's capsule as the filtrate. And then we have the motor arterioles, which transport the filtered blood away toward the second capillary bed. Now, there are additional cells involved here that are responsible for regulating blood pressure. They're called JGA cells. And what happens is the filtrate that we've been talking about enters the PCT, where absorption, tubular reabsorption, and tubular secretion both occur. The descending and ascending limbs of the loop of HENLE consist of what we call thick and thin segments. And then this absorption and secretion continue into DCT, but to a lesser extent than the PCT. And basically each collecting duct collects forming urine from the nephrons and responds to the posterior pituitary hormone, ADH, which we learned about in AMP1, by inserting water channels into the cell membrane to fine-tune the water recovery. All right, so that's essentially the renal physiology. Again, 3 steps. We have the non-selective filtration, and then the tubular reabsorption and tubular secretion. And a lot of times when we talk about those, we can talk about the reabsorption and secretion together because they are pretty much simultaneous processes. And the terms that we talked about, PCT and DCT, those may be new acronyms. And so it's important for you to know that PCT stands for proximal convoluted tubule, and DCT stands for distal convoluted tubule. So due to the constant net movement out, constant movement through the renal system of different substances, we refer to that process as filtration. So when we look at the term net filtration pressure, it's important for us to know that that's the difference between the forces that favor filtration. In other words, when the pressures are higher, more filtrate is produced. When the pressures are lower, less filtrate is produced. Just keep also in mind that the body only has between 4 and 6 liters of blood in total. So most of the filtrate that's produced by the glomeruli is immediately reabsorbed into the renal tubules, and the process continues. Okay, then we get into the conversation about enzymes as we tie that all into our study of the urinary system. So it's important to know that, as we talked about in AMP1, we have steroid hormones and protein hormones in our bodies. Angiotensin is a protein hormone, and basically it causes our blood vessels to become narrower. So in essence, it does help to maintain the blood pressure in our bodies and also the fluid balance in our bodies. And we'll talk more about fluid balance in chapter 26. But for right now, just take a look at this diagram, and that way you can associate what we've been talking about with the urinary system to these processes of protein hormones being produced. So essentially the enzyme renin is converting the proenzyme angiotensin 1. Okay, and speaking of fluid balance, it's important to know that positive charges inside the channels prevent the leakage of the electrolytes across the cell membrane. And at the same time, they allow water to move due to the osmosis. And here's a little bit more information about tubular reabsorption and secretion. Okay, again, there's the PCT with some further information about PCT, proximal convoluted tubule. Talks about what the PCT is responsible for: actively reabsorbing, passively reabsorbing, and secreting. And for those that learn better with visuals and graphs, these are some graphs. They are written more for graduate school. So, you know, if you want to try to, make sense of these or take these in or come to class with questions, I can try to answer those for you. Okay, and then kind of tying these ideas together, we learned about the PCT and the DCT. So the loop of HENLE basically leads from the PCT to the DCT. And another way to think of the loop of HENLE is the nephron loop. So basically it's a portion of the actual nephron. And there's its composition, along with what it's responsible for reabsorbing. And then a little bit more about DCT, distal convoluted tubule, with what it reabsorbs and secretes. And then further information about the collecting duct, and once again, what it reabsorbs and secretes. All right, now that we talked about the physiology, including a lot of the microphysiology that goes on in our bodies, let's look at the regulation of blood flow and kidney function in particular. So here's a big chart showing all the major hormones that influence these systems, the kidneys. And what's important for you to know at this point is that the kidneys are innervated by the sympathetic nerves of the autonomic nervous system. The sympathetic nerve activity essentially decreases blood flow to the kidney, making more blood available to other areas of the body during times of stress. The arteriolar myogenic mechanism maintains steady blood flow in our bodies by causing the smooth muscles to contract when blood pressure increases and causing it to relax when blood pressure decreases. So this feedback involves pancreas signaling at the JGA to cause vasoconstriction or vasodilation to maintain a steady rate of blood flow. And in this chart, the chart does a really good job of breaking down those vasoconstrictors, and some of these terms may seem like ones we've covered because we've talked about these today here. And other enzymes, proteins, and so forth are things that you may not be as familiar with. But these are the vasoconstrictors, the primary vasoconstrictors, the stimulus and the effects they have, and you don't have to memorize these necessarily. All right, we're going to just talk about big ideas. It's just a chart if you want to take it in a little more detail. And here are your primary vasodilators, once again, with the stimulus, the effect on the GFR and the effect on the RBF. So how do these major hormones play specific roles in regulating the body fluids within our bodies? So one of the important things to know is that the endocrine hormones act essentially from a distance, while the paracrine hormones act locally. And I'll give you some examples. We see angiotensin II at the bottom here, and angiotensin II is an active vasoconstrictor, and it increases blood pressure. Angiotensin II also stimulates aldosterone, specifically the aldosterone release from the adrenal cortex, which causes the collecting duct that we learned about to retain sodium, which then in turn promotes water retention and a longer-term rise in the blood pressure. Antidiuretic hormone, which we know as ADH, promotes water recovery by the collecting ducts by stimulating the insertion of aquaporin water channels into the cell membranes. Thus, the endothelians are elevated in cases of diabetic kidney disease, which increase sodium retention and decrease GFR, which we learned about. And then it's what we call the natriuretic hormones, which release primarily from the atria of the heart in response to the stretching of the atrial walls, which stimulate sodium excretion and thereby decrease the blood pressure. So that process with these hormones in play is what helps to continue to regulate homeostasis within the kidneys. So let's talk a little further now about the regulation of fluid volume and composition. So the hormones at play here, the major hormones are ADH again, aldosterone again, and ANH. The hormone progesterone is similar in structure to aldosterone, and it can bind to and actually weakly stimulate the aldosterone receptors. Once again, blood pressure is a reflection of the blood volume, and it's monitored by baroreceptors in the aortic arch and the carotid sinuses. When the blood pressure increases, more action potentials are sent to the CNS, which result in greater vasodilation and also greater GFR, and also more water lost in the urine. So you can make a sort of a chart or an outline to show all this. When ANH is released by the cardiomyocytes, when the blood pressure increases, that causes the sodium and water loss. And then the ADH at high levels causes vasoconstriction, in addition to its action on the collecting ducts to recover more water. We know that diuretics increase urine volume. And we also know that the mechanisms for controlling the sodium concentration in the blood include the renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system that we learned about, and the ADH. So when sodium is retained, naturally, as we learned about in AAP1, potassium is excreted. When sodium is lost, potassium is retained. Here's a little bit more about the urinary system and homeostasis. Here you can see we have vitamin D synthesis. Now, in order for vitamin D to become active, it needs to undergo a reaction in the kidney to become active. And then what happens is the activated vitamin D helps with the absorption of calcium into the digestive tract, and then the reabsorption into the kidney, and the maintenance of normal serum concentrations of calcium and phosphate. So that's one example, and here are some others, once again, of homeostasis within the urinary system. Let's now talk about homeostatic imbalances of the urinary system, and I'd like to take some time to highlight most of these. So polyuria essentially means an excess urinary output, which results from hormonal or metabolic issues, such as diabetes. So here we have diabetes insipidus, which is the production of large quantities of urine resulting in severe dehydration and also intense thirst. That typically occurs as a result of low ADH. Then we have oliguria, which is low urine output. We have anuria, which is severely low urinary output. So to quantify both of those, oliguria is typically an output of between 50 and 500 milliliters a day, whereas anuria is an output of 0 to 50 milliliters per day. And anuria is usually the result of injury or a transfusion reaction or low blood pressure or a combination of those things. Then we have dysuria, which is painful or difficult urination that can occur with certain pathologies that are co-occurring. For example, in a male, an enlarged prostate gland can compress the urethra and lead to dysuria. Let's jump down to urethritis. Urethritis is inflammation of the urethra. Pyelonephritis is an infection or inflammation of the kidney. We'll jump down here to cystitis, which is another itis condition, inflammation of the bladder. We know that incontinence is the inability to control urination voluntarily. There's different forms of incontinence. You may have heard of stress incontinence, which can involve periodic leakage due to stress, or urge incontinence, which is the inability to delay urination, or even overflow incontinence, which is a continual slow trickle of urine from the bladder. So the bladder in that sense is always full. Then we have urinary retention, which is the inability to expel urine even though the renal functioning that we've discussed is normal. Once again, that's common in males that have enlarged prostate glands. And that concludes my lecture on Chapter 25, the urinary system. Please let me know if you have any questions.